So, we are in chapter 2, and because we've had quite a lengthy break between the last time that we studied and this evening, I think it'd be a good idea for us just to do a little bit of a review, how we got to this point, what our objective is, what we hope to achieve during the course of this particular chapter. So what have we done? What have we learned so far? In broad strokes, we started off, Tanya, with a quest. And the quest is, before a person is born, our sages teach us that the soul is made to take an oath. And the oath seems very overwhelming at first when you look at it, because the oath is, swear that you will be a tzaddik, which means an absolutely righteous individual, and that you will not be a rasha, which means basically a non-righteous individual, somebody who perhaps behaves against what Hashem wants, and you're made to take that oath even before you're born, which of course immediately raises the question, how? How can you ask us to take an oath before we know what we're getting ourselves into? We don't understand the world. You're talking about a disembodied soul. You're talking about an entity that lives in the spiritual realms, and the undertaking impacts how we're going to live in a very physical, tempting kind of an environment. So how exactly does this work? What exactly are we supposed to be swearing to do? That's one question that feeds our conversation and our curiosity during the course of Tanya. But the truth is, there's a deeper question that lies beneath that. We're using words, tzaddik, rasha. We don't even know what those words are. We don't even know what it means to be a righteous individual. It's nice to create an aspiration, but it's fairly meaningless if nobody knows what that aspiration is supposed to mean. And what is a rasha that you're supposed to avoid so dramatically? Don't be a rasha. Well, what is a rasha? Is a rasha, as everybody thinks, somebody who's a terrible rogue, somebody who's a bad person, the villain. The villain in any good movie is the rasha, right? That's pretty much how people understand and perceive it. And a tzaddik, well, a tzaddik is me and my friends. We're the tzaddikim, we're the good guys. We're nice people, we pay our taxes, we smile at the cashier on the way out, we're tzaddikim. So we needed decent working definitions for these terms. And that's where we began our conversation. What are these things? And in the first chapter, we gave a whole lot of evidence to the fact that, firstly, there are really 5 categories in total, not just the 2. There's a perfect tzaddik, there's an imperfect tzaddik, there's an absolute rasha, there's a not-so-toxic rasha, and somewhere in the middle is a Beinoni, and we need to understand what all of these things are. So like any good mystical treatise, we say, hang on a second, if you want to understand principles, you first have to know what the deeper underlying themes are before you can talk about the principles. So it's all very well to throw out terminology and say, there's a tzaddik, there's a rasha, etc. What are they? But let's explore for a moment what it means to be a person, and specifically, what does it mean to be a Jewish person? Because that's who this book is written for. It's written for Jewish people to say, you have an opportunity to stand up and to achieve this objective of being a tzaddik and avoiding the pitfalls of being a rasha. So what does it mean to be a Jewish person? Let's start there. Because everything else is moot if we don't really understand who we're talking to. If you don't appreciate your audience, it's unlikely that you'll be able to give them a meaningful message. So what does it mean to be Jewish? Does it mean that you belong to a certain group of people that are persecuted through the course of history? Does it mean that you have certain facial features and that's what makes you Jewish? The classic, you don't look Jewish. Does it mean that we adhere to a certain set of laws, and then perhaps if you don't follow those laws or you reject those values, maybe you're not Jewish? What exactly does it mean to be Jewish? So in the first chapter, we said the first clue as to what it means to be Jewish, and only then can you start to explore what it means to be a tzaddik Jew or a rasha Jew or a Beinoni Jew. What does it mean to be Jewish? It means that you are going to live your life in a constant state of conflict. Now that might sound quite familiar to many of us. Oh yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. I'm always in a state of conflict, otherwise known as guilt. Always feeling that there's something that I'm doing which I should do better, or there's something that I'm doing which I should do more, or there's something that I'm doing that I really shouldn't do. The reason we have that conflict, we discovered in the first chapter, is because we are multicellular beings. That means we have 2 souls. And as soon as we appreciate that we have 2 souls, that will help us to understand what it means to be Jewish. One soul, which we met in chapter 1, is easy to access. It's there from the minute you open your eyes as a newborn baby. it's instinctive, it's impulsive, it is self-interested. So that's a part of ourselves which we call the nefesh hachiyunis. It's absolutely critical to stay alive. If you don't have the soul, how can you keep yourself alive? You need something that cares about you, that really wants you to wake up in the morning, that wants to make sure that you eat enough, that wants to make sure that you have shelter, that you have things that fulfill you. So it's a really important part of who we are. On the other hand, it's called nefesh habahamis. It's animalistic in its drives. And in the same way as an animal left to its own devices will only behave according to its instinctive impulses, it's exactly the same with a soul. Leave the soul to its own devices and who knows where it's going to land up. It also happens to be predisposed to certain negative traits, and we spoke about that. Things like the fire traits of anger and arrogance, or the water traits of lust, or the air traits of meaningless pursuits, or the earthy traits of depression and laziness. But at the same time, we also said part of the instinctive animal that is this animalistic soul is the instinct to try and do good things. The instinct to want to be nice, to be compassionate, to be generous, to even be a little bit bashful, actually, even though the Alter Rebbe did not speak specifically about it, but he alluded to it, that there's a Talmudic expression that Jews are somewhat bashful, although many people tell you that's not the case. We're somewhat chutzpahdik. So that's all part of the package deal called the first soul, the nefesh hachiyunis, the nefesh habahamis, the animalistic soul. It's the part that drives us to look after me. And now we're in chapter 2. Chapter 2 opened with a statement, v'nefesh hashenis b'Yisrael, the second soul within the Jewish experience, which is basically the part of us that makes us Jewish, chelek Eloka mimal mamash, is a piece of God, literally from on high. Now we're trying to unpack that. Because actually this chapter is the core chapter of understanding what it is to be Jewish. To tell us that people are impulsive, big deal. We all know that. If you're an evolutionist, you certainly believe that we are impulsive, instinctive, with a drive for self-preservation. I don't need Tanya to teach me that. But this nefesh hashenis, the second soul that we have, that's something altogether different. It is literally a piece of God that pulsates inside of ourselves. That's something absolutely unique, and we need to appreciate what exactly do we mean. And are we being fanciful? Are we being poetic over here when we use this kind of language? So in the first part of the chapter, we used one metaphor, and that was the metaphor of how Hashem created the entire everything by speaking. And yet when it came to designing the soul, it says that he exhaled, he breathed the soul. Now that immediately tells you there's a magnificent difference between how everything else was created and how the soul was made. Everything else was created with a few pithy lines, 10 instructions, make a world, let there be, let there be. Let there be sounds like somebody who's got a whole host of servants and snaps their fingers and say, let there be tea, let there be lunch. It doesn't require a tremendous amount of personal effort. Let there be these things, and then they come into being. That implies that the entire creative process requires minimal input from God. Minimal input. It's the least of the superficial energy that Hashem could potentially share. That's what he used in order to make everything that we know, and that includes the spiritual realities. But when you breathe, breathing is personal. Ask an asthmatic. Breathing is personal. Breathing is something you feel. Have you ever been in high altitude? Ever been hiking up a mountain? And you reach over 2,000 meters, suddenly you appreciate what breathing is. You feel it. It's personal. You hear your own breathing inside your head. You feel every breath. So by distinguishing between the description in the Torah of creation and the description of the production of a soul, calling the one speaking and the other breathing, Hashem has made a marked difference between the two realities. Everything that exists in the world is kind of powered by a superficial energy, and souls are personal. This is where God invests himself. And then we said we'll explore an even more profound metaphor to explain this better. And that is the metaphor of being called God's children, because the relationship that exists between a parent and child is an intensely intimate relationship. And that's regardless of whether the parent even knows the child or vice versa. So you could have a child who's, God forbid, abandoned at birth and will still retain this intensely intimate relationship with his or her parents. Because that relationship, parent and child, is not a relationship you build over time. Like, for example, the relationships of friends or spouses. Those you develop, you invest, you build that relationship. And depending on how well you build it, that will determine how deep the relationship goes. And if you neglect that relationship over a period of time, it might erode and it might fall away completely. And you could say, well, we used to be friends, or a couple used to be married. But the parent-child relationship, that's intensely intimate, because there's nothing that a child could ever do, or that a parent could ever do, that will absolve or dissolve that relationship. So here's the child who was abandoned at birth, and it could be decades later that we discover the link, because it's a biological link to the parent, and it's absolutely intimate. It's the link of who I am. It's not a link of what we've done. It's not a link of how we've connected. It's who I am. So the moment we discover that Hashem calls us his children, and that's the secret to our soul, now we understand that we're talking about something which is intensely intimate. That's what we began to discover in this chapter, and that's what we're going to begin to unpack in greater detail in the next piece, which we'll start now. One of the questions that we asked, it's important just to remember this question because it's pretty much where we left off. So one of the questions that we asked is, hang on a second, if you're telling me that every one of us has this nefesh hashenis, this unique soul, which we're going to learn to call the nefesh eloikis. So we spoke about a nefesh habahamis, an animalistic or animating soul, and now we're going to speak about a nefesh eloikis, a divine soul. So that's how we'll refer to it going forward. If we've all got it, if you've got it, if I've got it, if Moses had it, if some Jew who doesn't even know that they're Jewish had it. So if we've all got the soul, how come we're all so different? We've all got a piece of God that lives inside us. So how come that piece of God might manifest in one person as this deeply dedicated, deeply spiritual, mystical, prophetic, righteous individual? And the other could be a person who has absolutely no concept of anything beyond the here and now. How's that possible? We both have the same soul. So that's what we'll begin to explore, and in doing so, we'll begin to understand far better what this metaphor of being Hashem's children really means. So let's start from the beginning of the metaphor. Our question was, how do we have so diverse a range of Jewish people if ultimately every single one of us is chelek eloika mimal mamash, literally a piece of God? Doesn't seem to make sense. What, does God come in different shapes and sizes? Are there different degrees of God? Some people get more God, some people... How does it all work? So in order to explain this, we say, kemoshel haben. The metaphor that we're using is the metaphor of the parent-child relationship. So let's go back and have a look at the nature of this metaphor. Kemoshel haben hanimshach mimoyach ha'av. You probably remember that last time we spoke about the idea that everything begins with intention. That means to say, yes, of course there is a physical process called conception. And the physical process of conception is a mechanical, biological process that involves certain parts of the human anatomy that engage in the process of producing what it takes in order to conceive a child. That's for sure, and nobody can deny that. Yet what we often tend to overlook is that everything begins with an intention. That's how we are. That's what makes human beings unique. We begin with an intention, with a conscious intention to behave in a particular way. So, should a person choose, and that's a key word, choose, that they would like to conceive a child, that's a conscious intention. It's not like in the animal kingdom. In the animal kingdom, there's purely an impulsive drive. There's no thought of family planning. There's no thought of how are we going to afford another child. There's no thought of, please God, I hope that this child inherits these genes and not those genes. I hope they have your teeth and my eyes, or whatever the particular thing is. Now, animals don't have that. In the animal kingdom, there's a simple, basic impulse to reproduce so that the species continues to exist. There's no conscious intention. So there might be mating rituals between different kinds of animals, and they're really fascinating for us, and you watch the peacock and whatever it is. It's very interesting. But at the end of the day, there is no conscious intention that says, you are the one with whom I want to start a family. And yes, of course, there are certain creatures that mate for life, absolutely. But they don't have that sense of, sitting around and playing Monopoly together or going on family holidays. So in our world, the idea of conceiving a child begins with a conscious intention. Conscious intention to say, I have something that I want to contribute to the world, to my life, to our family, to the family name, whatever it is. And for that reason, we say that it's important to acknowledge that the physical, mechanical, biological process of conception starts in moyach ha'av. It starts in the father's brain, because the father is the one who has to choose to have this conscious intention. And it's not just that it starts in the brain in some kind of a divorced fashion, okay? There is a rational decision that a person makes. I'm ready to settle down. I'm ready to have a family. You are the one. It's more than that. Because we understand, and science has helped us to understand, perhaps in the day that the Alter Rebbe wrote the Tanya, maybe they didn't have such an acute understanding biologically of how this works as we do today. But we understand today that the brain sends out these neurological impulses to the rest of the body, and that's how anything happens in the body. So for example, the fact that your heart begins to race doesn't start in your heart, it starts in the brain. So the brain recognizes that in a fight or flight situation, we've got to send more blood to the body so that the person is ready for the confrontation. Therefore, your heart beats faster. Or your brain recognizes that your temperature has risen too high, so we have to perspire. So it sends these neurological impulses to your sweat glands to say, let's help cool off the body. It's not just because there's heat to the skin, so the skin kind of independently chooses to behave in a certain way. So it's exactly the same. The fact that a person can produce the process of conception had to have started in the brain. And the brain creates this neurological impulse. In the language of our sages, it travels down the spinal cord. So through the neurological system until eventually it translates into a physical seed that is produced or that is released. Now what that essentially means is that the brain's impulse translates into a physical response from the body that eventually becomes the seed of conception. So where does the child originate? In the brain. Now here's where it gets interesting. Every single part of the child that will emerge after 9 months as a fully formed, healthy baby, you know what they say, 10 fingers, 10 toes? All of that's going to emerge after 9 months, right down to toenails. Now, we use toenails because that's, if you think about it, I'm sure everybody will agree, the least spiritual, least complex part of the human body. Toenails. What would happen, God forbid, if a person chipped a toenail? I think they'd manage. Fingernail, different story. That could be a little bit of a crisis. But a toenail, no, nicht gefährlich. It's considered a very dead part of the body. That's why you can cut the nails without necessarily feeling any pain. And if you do feel pain, it won't be from the nail itself. It might be from the surrounding skin or the skin underneath, which is particularly sensitive, or the point where the nail attaches to the toe. But the nail itself is kind of dead to feeling. It's even more dead in a sense than hair. They're pretty much the same material, but hair has some kind of movement to it. Okay, this is not a shampoo ad, but you get the idea, right? It has some life to it, it has some body to it. Whereas nails are quite stiff and they're quite rigid and effectively don't really exhibit much life. So it's quite incredible to imagine that the creation of a human being, obviously, logically, has to come from something intensely powerful. It might be microscopic, but it's intensely powerful. So how does conception happen? You've got this tiny little seed, this tiny little cellular organism that contains, packed inside of it, all the DNA information that is required to stimulate the production of a whole human being. So every part of that human being comes from that original seed, much like a tree. Every single part of the tree comes from that original seed. It could be one of these massive baobab trees that you could like almost drive through, and yet it came from a tiny little seed that had compacted in a zip file inside of it all of the DNA that was required in order to produce this tree. It's exactly the same with a baby. That seed of conception carries inside of it the code of everything that is necessary to produce this child. Obviously, once it meets up with an egg that it can fertilize, obviously. So that's when you get the full package. That's when you get the full DNA of what this person will need in order to become a person. Even toenails, the end result, almost the most superficial dimension of the person, can track back to that DNA. How did it happen? The way that it happens is this cellular organism remains for 9 months in the uterus and goes through this whole cell division process that allows it effectively to start to unfold. Like if you can picture the scene of, those time-lapse videos that you have of a flower. So, you watch the bud, and then the next thing, the flower kind of opens up in time-lapse. It's the same kind of thing. It's the cells start to unpack into more and more and more cells, and they start to subdivide and multiply, and then the next thing you know, 9 months down the line, you have a fully formed human being. What's interesting, though, is how we're going to define the nature of those 9 months. Almost exactly the opposite of how you and I define it when we talk about it. During those 9 months, v'yordo mimadrego lemadrego. During those 9 months, this seed, this original zygote, this original fertilized egg goes down in stature. Yordo mimadrego lemadrego. It goes down in stature. Lehistanois, and it evolves. Or lehisavois mimeno tzipornaim, until eventually it can produce something that is so diminished as toenails. Let's understand for a second what's going on over here. What's this expression of going down? It sounds a little bit strange. So pause everything for a second, and let's step out of the story and imagine that you are the expectant couple, right? So it's very exciting. Oh my gosh, Baruch Hashem, and this is the due date, and it's very exciting. So in the early stages of pregnancy, in the early part of the first trimester, the notion of pregnancy is a little bit far-fetched, a little bit abstract. You look at those charts and the doctors show you exactly how tiny the thing is at this point. It's all a little bit far-fetched. No features, nothing that looks human, nothing that the person can feel, the mother can feel inside of her. It's just a concept, really. It's just an idea. As the pregnancy progresses, in our minds, we say it's progress. The baby is becoming more developed. You can, if you scan the mother using ultrasound, you can start to pick up the shape of the child, the features of the child, the length of the child, an assessment of what the weight of the child will be. Time goes on, and you start to see on the mother, from the outside, you can start to see that something's developing inside of her. There's actually a physical change to her body. And then you get to a point where the mother can start to feel movement. This is progress. I've gone from this being a concept, something surreal, to something so real. That's how we view it. So from our perspective, from the outside looking in, as pregnancy goes, so the child becomes more and more developed. And of course, that's why we don't want, God forbid, we don't want a child to come too soon, because we want to make sure that everything is developed. And if a mother goes into premature labor, they start with all these things to try and slow the labor and try and stimulate steroids to stimulate the development of the lungs, because we don't want a child to come out with certain parts underdeveloped. In our mind, it's a progression. And the ultimate state of the progression is 10 fingers, 10 toes. The baby comes out, all the pieces are in place, it smiles, it gurgles, it cries, does all the things that it's supposed to do. Then we say Mazel Tov. At the beginning of the pregnancy, we don't say Mazel Tov. We say B'sha'a Tova. Please God, everything should happen at a good time. And that's because our experience as humans is we only relate to things that are tangible. So a newly conceived fetus is intangible, and a 9-month full-term delivery is nachas. It's tangible, it's real to us. Let's step out of that for a second, and let's explore this if we were looking from a purely conceptual perspective. Purely conceptual. At the moment of conception, how much potential for new human is there at the moment of conception? It's an interesting question, right? It's a strange question to reflect on. But we're talking abstractly now. We're talking conceptually, from a philosophical, objective perch. So at the moment of conception, there's 100% potential for human development. That means at this point in time, we don't know what's going to develop. We don't know if this person is going to come out looking like dad or looking like mom or looking like some cousin. We don't know. There's a full range of possibility. It's all potential. As the fetus develops, and as each feature develops, so that potential reduces. So the moment that baby starts to develop a nose that comes from the mother's line, from the mother's side of the family, all of the potential of looking like the father is diminished. And as another feature starts to reflect the mother's side of the family, so the chances of looking like the father diminish further. And as, for example, the lungs of the child develop, and this child happens to be, as most children in Johannesburg, predisposed to asthma, so the potential of a normal, absolutely healthy 100% lung diminishes. God forbid, if a mother gets ill in the first trimester, and that illness somehow affects the child's development, let's say, for example, German measles, right? Classic concern for a first trimester of pregnancy. That could have a devastating effect, God forbid. So the child had full potential of growth, but now because of the introduction of an illness into the mix, or let's say that the mother abused her body during the pregnancy, so there was alcohol added in, or the mother smoked, or whatever it is, these are things that could stunt certain developments of that child, so the potential diminishes. From our perspective, when the baby is born, brilliant. It looks like it's progressed to the ultimate state. But from the perspective of potential of human development, as each phase develops, so potential is lost. That's why we call the pregnancy experience, from a purely life force perspective, we call that yerida midarga ledarga. That's, you're going down from level to level. You're going down from a level of absolute power to a level of less power to a level of this is now who you are and you cannot change it. I don't want to get into the whole conversation about genetic engineering and designer babies and all that kind of stuff, because that's exactly this issue. Can you meddle with the development of a child and therefore cause the child to turn out differently? Which of course has all kinds of ethical issues, and it's really not a conversation for now, but it aligns with exactly this point. As long as there's potential, you can still meddle. If it's further down the line, it's too late. There's nothing you can do. Now, we're using this as a metaphor, right? So let's develop the metaphor a little bit further. At the moment of conception, every single part of this microscopic seed of conception has infinite possibility to it. Yes, of course, some of that DNA will turn into a brain. Some of that DNA will turn into a toenail. That's how it's going to pan out. But right now, at the moment of conception, you cannot distinguish. You cannot see which part of this fertilized egg is going to turn into toenails and which into a brain. As the baby develops, certain parts of that DNA diminish in power more rapidly than others. So the part of the DNA that forms the cells that will become the brain will diminish much less from this incredible human potential than, let's say, the part of the DNA that becomes the cells that become the toenails, because that part of us radically diminishes. It just becomes toenails. Yet, nobody could ever turn around scientifically and say, toenails were an add-on right at the end, just before the baby was born. They kind of clipped on, they stuck on toenails. It wasn't really part of the original DNA. That would be highly unscientific, right? Nobody can say, that wasn't part of the original conception. Yes, it was. Just that the coding of the body is such that some of the code becomes toenails and other becomes brain. So now here's the question. If we need a DNA sample of a human being, can we get the DNA sample from their toenail? Interesting question, right? Now, it may not be the most practical, and that's why they do inside the cheek. It's an easy swab, easy place to access cells. But conceptually, why not? That's DNA. DNA is equally found in every single part of the body, which is fascinating. So it looks like it's just toenails, but it's got exactly the same DNA that the brain has. That's fascinating. And that's the metaphor that we want to develop. So let's read it inside. V'im kol zeh, in spite of the fact that there's this tremendous downgrade of this part of the body that at one point was just unbridled human potential, and now it's simple toenails, then akshurom yuchedes beyichud niflavi atzum b'mehusav atzmuso harishan shahoisa tipas moyach ha'av. What's fascinating is that this toenail remains kshura, remains connected, but more than connected. It remains meyuchedes, which means bound with, and he uses the expression beyichud nifla ve'atzum, with an intense and incredible connection. With what? With its original form and state, which was a neurological impulse from the father's brain. In other words, what are we saying? In those days, they didn't have the language that we have to speak about DNA. They didn't have the language that it was possible biologically to understand that every single part of the body is part of an intrinsic essence that makes you who you are. Again, it's not what you do, it's not how you behave, it's not who you fraternize with, it's not the choices that you make, it is who you are in an indelible fashion. You can't change it. You can't go and exchange your DNA at some point and say, okay, I don't like being this person anymore. Can I download the version 2.0? It doesn't work that way. And that's what the Alter Rebbe is telling us. Even as a toenail, that part of the human body is intrinsically and inherently connected to how it was at the beginning of its journey, when it was just an impulse, so to speak, a chemical production inside the father's brain. Now that's effectively our first clue to understanding the nature of neshamas. Because we're people, and because we are so used to judging things based on their appearance, in the language of Microsoft, it's what you call WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. Because we're so used to seeing the world from that perspective, we assume it to be true. And the crazy thing about modern living and the advent of science is that science illustrates to us that what you see is never what you get. So right now, right now we're all doing the same thing, right? We're all staring into a screen. And as far as we're concerned, that's what we're doing right now. We're staring into a screen. The truth of the matter is, obviously we're not staring into a screen. Right now we're looking at a screen. Behind that screen is this whole circuit board that's running this particular device that you happen to be using right now, whatever device it is. And that circuit board is linked into a whole lot of electrical impulses that allow the transmission of my voice, the picture that you're seeing, right across the internet into your personal space. That's what's happening right now. You don't see it. Do you see it? Now that I'm saying it, you probably can visualize in your mind's eye. You can visualize, like these little sparks moving across circuit boards, or maybe you can hear the pinging. Anybody who remembers the good old, well, maybe not so good. Remember the old modems, the dial-up modems that used to have, pa-ting, pa-ting. You could probably visualize in your mind's ear the sound of like the pinging of the connection that's happening between us. But it's not what you see. When you touch the screen of your device, because it's got a little green icon on it, and in your mind that means WhatsApp. That green icon means WhatsApp. It's not. That green icon is an activator for a whole string of code that you, quite frankly, are not interested in, that runs the program that allows WhatsApp to happen. So let me ask you this question. If the phone that you're using is the top of the range, newest phone that's just come onto the market. And the phone that I'm using is 15 years old and near obsolete. And you have WhatsApp on your phone, and I have WhatsApp on my phone. Is my WhatsApp inferior to yours? Now, the truth of the matter is some of the functionality might be limited because of the device that I'm using, but the code that runs WhatsApp on your phone is exactly the same code that runs WhatsApp on my phone. The hardware may have limitations, but the software is the same. So now look at a human being. If I analyze a human being's brain and I analyze a human being's toenail, the hardware is completely different. The hardware of the brain is very advanced. It can function at incredible speeds, do multiple tasks simultaneously. The toe has very old, outdated, archaic hardware that can barely do anything. In fact, all it can do is just be and grow a little bit. That's pretty much all it can do. Now, the software that runs a toenail is human DNA, my DNA. And the software that runs my brain is DNA, my DNA. And they're both identical. Which means it doesn't matter how it appears on the outside. It doesn't matter how this particular part of the body has evolved. Fundamentally, intrinsically, it is still the same pulsating energy that was there right at the beginning, at the moment of conception, and even before the moment of conception, at the moment of conscious intention for there to be conception. It's effectively the same energy, the same pulses. Plus, וגם עכשיו בבן יניקס הציפורניים מחיוסים נמשכס מי המוח שבראש. At this point, we'll clarify a little bit more clearly why we chose dafka to speak about toenails as opposed to other parts of the body that perhaps are not really that developed. Why dafka toenails? Because he wants to tell us something interesting. He wants to tell us that now the child has become really an independent entity of the parent. You know, obviously during the process of conception and gestation, the child is dependent mostly on the mother, right? For 9 months, the child is completely dependent on the mother. Does not have the ability to live independently. And then the moment the child is born, the child already has some kind of independence. And in the case of a Jewish child, by the age of 35, probably gets a little bit more independence as well. So what happens is now you've got an independent child who's living outside of the body, outside the house, outside of the rules of the parents, and yet inside the software that's running this child is the same software as the parents, same DNA. So there's this incredibly intimate connection between them, even though they might be on opposite ends of the world. And then there's another thing to consider, and that is what's running the toenail right now in that child is the child's own brain, which of course we take for granted because we understand biologically that that's how things work, that the brain controls every part of the body. But when you think about it philosophically, it's actually quite amazing. It seems so beneath the brain's pay grade to worry about the growth of a toenail. There's such important things to consider, like breathing, staying out of trouble, innovating, thinking, philosophizing, listening to the Tanya shir. I don't know, there's so many things that the brain is occupied with. Keeping the toe in line, come on. See, like surely that should be outsourced. Maybe there should be like the ankle department should be responsible for anything below a certain altitude on the human body. That's the fascinating system that Hashem created, is that we fundamentally come from the brain, we come from intellect, we come from conscious intention, and then we develop into beings where every single part of our system relies on the brain in order to run. Now, of course, I don't need conscious intention, otherwise we'd go mad. Could you imagine if your brain had to be conscious about every single part of the body running? Obviously not. But the fact is, it's still the brain. And that's interesting to us. So with this, we have two key parts of our metaphor. The one is that no matter what the child and the different parts of the child may look like, at the end of the process, every part of that came from the same source and is run on the same sourceware. Second of all, in the independent entity, now the child that is living independently of the parents, the entire system is run by the brain. Those two facets of this metaphor are going to be really important for us. But before we do that, let's just see why we're so fixated on toenails. Because there's a Gemara that tells us that there are three partners in the production of a child. The parents, and God is the third partner. And then the Gemara breaks it down. And the Gemara says, Loiven shemimenu gidim va'atzomois v'tzipornaim. Loiven, the white material, which is contributed by the father, the seed of the father, is the core production of the white elements of the human body, like sinews, bones, and nails. The Gemara then goes on to say, red represents the color of the mother's contribution, almost like the uterine wall, that red, the red that would be associated with blood. That contributes to the muscles, to the organs, and to blood itself. And God is the one who provides, obviously, the capacity to breathe and the spirit that fills the body. But you see what's interesting over here is that the Gemara wants to create an association between the nails, the most inanimate part of the human, and the father's input, the conscious intention, the brain power that started the entire process of conception. Oh, and it goes deeper than that. As it says in Eitz Chaim, which is the teachings of the Arizal, the great Kabbalistic revolutionary Rabbi Isaac Luria, who lived in the 16th century, Besoid levushim shel Adam Arishim began Eden shahoyu tzipornayim mi bechinas moyach tuvuna. So we're told that Adam and Eve, obviously, while they were in the Garden of Eden, did not wear clothing. It was only after the sin that they became aware of the fact that they had to wear clothing, and they were kind of embarrassed. And the Torah tells us that Hashem assisted them, and He provided them with what's called kosnois oir. And there are two interpretations in the Talmud exactly what that means. One interpretation is that it means that He gave them clothing that are made from the skins of other animals, like wool. And another interpretation is kosnois oir means that it's the kind of thing that sits comfortably on the skin, meaning that it was made out of linen. So what did they have before that? Because you need some kind of protection, right? So Eitz Chaim explains that the skin of Adam and Eve was more similar in its makeup to our nails than to our skin. In fact, there's even some who understand that to mean that their skin was kind of translucent, which is an interesting concept. In the Eitz Chaim, it explains that it's not just that. It's not just that the material was like this harder material or this translucent material. It says something fascinating. It says the nature of the skin of Adam and Eve prior to the sin is that their skin was nail-like because the nature of nails is that they have a very deep connection to moyach tevuna. Effectively, we're told in Kabbalah that there are different parts of the brain that are responsible for different types of intellectual process. So you have, for example, moyach chachma, which is the innovative brain. It's a part of the brain where we get ideas from, creativity, the ability to learn, to study, to be open to new concepts. And then you get what is called moyach tevuna. That's the brain of analysis, the brain of research, the brain of trying to understand concepts thoroughly. So in Kabbalah, we're told that there's a very interesting link between nails and the brain of an analysis, the analytical brain. Now, we're not doing a Kabbalistic study over here of why that is, but what we are interested in is the notion that there's a direct connection between nails and the brain. That's why out of all the parts of the body that we chose, that we were going to use to illustrate the fact that all the way down the evolutionary process, there's still a link between every part of the body, even the least complex parts of the body, and the brain. We dafka chose to use nails because there's a Kabbalistic principle that dafka, that part of the body that seems so inanimate, has this very strong link to a part of the brain that is so animated, the analytical brain. So what have we learned so far? We've learned that our metaphor teaches us two things. And next week, please God, we'll have to unpack what that metaphor means for souls. But the two things are that there's an evolutionary process of the child's development that will never take away from the child's inherent connection to the parent. And we've learned that once the child becomes an independent child, the child relies on his or her own brain in order to be able to survive. Those two elements, those two parts of the metaphor are going to be critical for us to understand how the neshama really works and why it is that we all have a piece of God inside of us, and yet we can be so spiritually diverse. As they say in the classics, to be continued.